This video is sponsored by Describe. How can you pull off establishing shots in D&D games, where the party sees their destination coming into view and then travels that distance? What's the best way to handle that moment? I was working on a script for this week's Critical Role Demystified episode, which was actually a live show at Gen Con back in 2016. And there was a moment where Matt and his players weren't quite on the same page. And I wound up writing like 6 paragraphs about what was essentially a 2-minute interaction, so I realized this really needed to be spun off into its own video. So that's what you're watching right now. A video where I dive into extraordinary detail into a lesson we can learn from a single moment of miscommunication. So here's the interaction. Matt's party is in the Feywild, and they're trying to reach a spooky swamp, but the swamp is surrounded by a network of rivers. And a Vox Machina emerges from a forest, and they can faintly see the rivers ahead of them. They're about half a mile away. And Matt describes the rivers, and then just turns to his players expectantly. And his players realize he's waiting for them to do something, so they try to interact with the rivers.
But like the rapids are like right there.
You can see them maybe about a half a mile in front of you, and you can see the spray occasionally kind of shooting off some of the rocks, and the shore itself of the river just barely shows the speed of the water passing by.
I'm gonna take my staff, and I kind of want to like feel how deep it is. You know,
Okay, so you decide to walk the half mile to make it to the river.
thought we were there. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, let's walk the half mile. It's a half mile.
And it looks like a long river. Like there's no.
It's a series of long rivers that completely wrap around the shade murk. One side, it seems to be vanishing into the green sea, which you could just barely see to the far, seaward side of you. And it just curves around the outside of the shade murk and vanishes into the horizon.
Interesting. It's a river.
It's a big river.
It looks like a river at the very least.
Don't
do we
trust
have
anything in the
Don't trust
Can
anything in the Feywild.
I perception to see if there's any sort of creatures that are visible?
Do you want to get closer to it first?
Let's start walking
You know,
towards
let's
it.
walk
Sure,
towards it.
yeah,
I
all
feel
right.
like.
You have a jaunty jog on your way towards the Gilded Run.
It seems incredibly likely that part of the reason his players are confused in this moment probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's a live show. There's an audience, they've got a lot on their minds, they might not be able to hear Matt that well, and I don't want to put any of these players on blast for that. But instead, I want to drill down on the fact that Matt was apparently just sitting there waiting for them to respond. Because I started to wonder, what was he expecting them to do? And that got me thinking about why he paused here at all. And that made me realize, hey, wait a minute, I do this too. I try to pull off these establishing shots in my games, and the reveal is never quite as spectacular as I would like because there's always this awkward sense of the players not knowing how to respond. Sure, this game might have had mitigating circumstances, but Matt Mercer does do this from time to time in his normal games as well. And so do I. And it wasn't until I rewatched this moment that I actually saw my behavior in this scene. And I saw my players reflected in these players. My players who also sometimes struggle to know what to do when you tell them, hey, you see the place you're going. What do you want to do? So that's what we're talking about today. Can we do an establishing shot where the players see where they're going without getting that awkward moment of waiting for the players to react to your description? How can we get a moment like this? Without getting a moment like this.
Jeff, your turn.
Oh, it's my turn. Oh, what do I do? Roll dice?
You tell me what you want to do. Then I roll the dice to see if you're successful.
What are my choices?
Okay, you're slowing things down, Jeff. Shirley, what do you want to do?
Now, like I said, part of the issue is that Matt's players just didn't seem to clock what Matt was trying to convey about the rivers, how far away they were, how they worked, etc. And I sympathize. When you're running a D&D game, even when you're not on stage in front of 1,000 fans, you're lucky if your players understand even 50% of what you're trying to communicate with them. There is no magic bullet to guarantee your players understand what you're trying to say about your world. Unless you use today's sponsor, Describe. Describe is a fantastic online toolset that provides pre-written narration that you can read aloud in your games. When you use their scenes at your table, you can drastically reduce the likelihood that you'll be misunderstood, especially when you're dealing with a location, as Matt was in this episode. And that's because Describe has a fantastic collection of maps, which each have several descriptions attached to the different zones. So this way, you can find an incredible battle map and be able to describe each landmark, some of which also hint at potential encounters or plot twists you can tie into your game. And several of the maps have different variations, like a nighttime mode, so you can better integrate them into your game and immerse your players in the world. And these maps are compatible with Foundry Virtual Tabletop, so if you run your game through Foundry, you can easily drop these maps directly into your campaign tonight. And Describe is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit describe.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 10% off of your first subscription payment. Once again, that's dscryb.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. First of all, to see why this moment didn't work, we kind of need to start by explaining how D&D works in the first place. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you probably already understand the rhythm of a D&D game, but this is where we need to start in order to explain why I wound up falling into a deep dive on this subject. See, the way D&D works is essentially very simple. The DM will offer the players a scenario or a prompt for the players to take some sort of action, and the players will respond. Then the DM will respond to what they said they wanted to do, and in turn, present another development that the players can react to. Effectively, imagine a ball being passed back and forth between the DM and the players. That's really all D&D is. Sometimes the players can ask for the ball specifically, or sometimes the DM can grab the ball unexpectedly and throw the players a twist, but most of the time, especially during exploration scenes, the format is very simple. The DM presents the scenario and then passes the ball to the players so they can react to it. So when I see a scene like this, where the cast keeps asking questions but not knowing what to do with Matt's responses, I start to wonder if the issue is the prompt they're being presented with. Because it's one thing if 1 or 2 players sort of scratch their heads and don't know how to respond. That happens to players all the time. But when 6 of them do it all at once, that seems like an issue with the scenario itself. Because of course it makes perfect sense to tell your players, you see a thing in the distance. It's realistic. There are plenty of times where it just makes sense for your characters to see their destination long before they actually get to it. And it's also dramatic. It can help to illustrate the scale of their destination. There are so many moments in The Lord of the Rings where the characters see an important location long before they actually reach it, but let's return to the one I used at the top of this video because it's honestly one of my favorites. The scene when Gandalf and Pippin ride over a hill and they see Minas Tirith. And Gandalf says, "Minas Tirith, City of Kings." And we as an audience are just in awe of this glorious city. But you remember what happens next, right? We see this incredible establishing shot of the city, which is actually diegetic. It's from Pippin's perspective. And then we immediately cut to Gandalf and Pippin riding through the streets of the city. We don't watch them ride those last few miles to reach the city gates because that would not be very interesting. Or think about when Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Gandalf arrive at Edoras. We see them riding up from Eowyn's perspective, which is not how we're likely to structure these moments in our own games. And then we just cut to the party arriving at the gates. No muss, no fuss, no long, protracted arrival. They're just here now. In fact, the only reason we cut to them at all outside the gates is so we can have the moment where Aragorn sees the flag fall to the ground, serving as a metaphor for the fall of Rohan. And fun fact, the only reason we even have this moment is because the flag accidentally ripped off while they were filming Eowyn's scene. It was not supposed to do that. So they turned it into a moment with Aragorn outside the city. It's a really nice touch. The fact that they were able to take this accidental moment and turn it into arguably one of the most powerful metaphors in the entire trilogy really speaks to the power of collaborative storytelling. Speaking of accidents that made it into the movie, did you know that in the scene where Aragorn kicks the orc helmet, Viggo Mortensen actually broke his toe? But we get that moment outside because it's a powerful dramatic beat. And then we immediately cut away again, and the actual scene begins with the party inside the city walls. To return to our metaphor, that's when the GM passes the ball back to the players. In Minas Tirith, the GM doesn't just show the outside of the city, we also then get a montage of our heroes riding through the city streets, traveling through all of these different levels and districts, and finally arriving at the very top of the city, at the palace doors and the White Tree of Gondor. And only then does the GM pass the ball back to the players as they enter the throne room. But that's not what Matt Mercer does. Matt's approach is typically more like that of an open-world video game. But that's still a fundamentally different experience. Let's set aside the obvious fact that holding a finger down on a controller and watching your character move through the space feels very different from having your GM say, "You walk half a mile to the riverbank." But if you look at an open-world game, like The Witcher 3 for example, based on what little I've actually had a chance to play of that game, there isn't a long ramp-up in real time where you can see your destination the entire time but don't have any decisions to make before you actually reach it. From my, admittedly, somewhat limited experience with open-world games, if you can see your destination long before you reach it, then there's probably going to be a bunch of stuff you can do on the way there. And if that's not the case and all you're going to do is just walk or run or ride or swing to that destination, then there are usually still a few small options in between, like opportunities to harvest items or NPCs you can talk to, even if they only repeat the same line whenever you talk to them. And those traversals where you can see the destination the entire time usually only take a minute or two in between when you first see the location and when you actually get there. And during traversals of any length, a lot of open world games will give you other things to listen to, in order to distract you and keep you engaged.
Let's discuss the costume lunatic who just literally destroyed a bank. Wait, you think I'm talking about Herman Schultz? Oh no, I meant Spider-Man.
So let's return to our D&D example. In this scene, Matt is throwing the ball back to his players too early and too often. And when your players aren't doing what you expect them to do, or just aren't doing anything, it's probably because they don't realize that you're waiting on them. So here's a handy rule of thumb for when you're GMing, especially when you're running an exploration scene. Ask yourself, what is the dramatic question of this scene? Every scene should have a dramatic question running underneath it, keeping the story moving. What are you going to do isn't enough. That's usually just how we verbalize the subliminal question of the scene. For example, in the last Critical Role Demystified episode, Vox Machina was traveling through a forest, and they were following the path set by their guide, but they were also being tempted to wander off the path by other enticing curiosities. And we can see how a dramatic question can drive a scene. Are you going to leave the safety of the path? Isn't a dramatic question, because there's no sense of stakes, no sense of consequence. If the answer is yes, then the response is, okay, you stay safe, and nothing happens. But there's also no good reason for them to answer no, so of course the players will answer yes because it's the only logical response. Or they'll try to ask clarifying questions because they're trying to find the dramatic question beneath the scene, whether they realize it or not. However, if instead the scene is structured around the question, are you going to leave the safe path to investigate the strange music and laughter you hear coming from deeper into the forest? Well, that is a dramatic question, because it asks the player to choose between doing something safe or following their curiosity. And in the next episode of Critical Role I'm going to talk about on Thursday, most of the session revolves around the question, how are you going to cross these rivers without falling in? This is a dramatic question because it requires action from the players, and there are clear consequences to failure. You fall into the rapids, and it's dangerous and bad. So if your scene has no dramatic question running underneath it, then either introduce some drama, or cut away to the next dramatic moment. In this scene, when Matt describes what they see from afar, there's no question there. There's nothing to interact with. So his players are holding the ball, but they don't know what to do with it. They're trying to figure out how to respond. Can they investigate the water and see how deep it is? Can they see if there are any creatures or other dangers they need to be aware of? What are we supposed to do here? And Matt's response is just, well, you're not there yet. Well then, Matt, why are we stopped? This is kind of like being on a road trip to hike Yosemite, and on the way, you pull over at an overlook and stop the car and say, look, you can see Yosemite out the window, that's where we're going. And then you just turn back to your passengers and wait for them to ask you to turn the car back on so you can finish the drive to the parking lot. And again, let me be as clear as possible. This is a bad habit I have too. And rewatching this scene brought it into sharp relief. I realized that when I show my players an environment from far away, I will often try to turn that moment into a scene rather than let it be what it really should be. A moment in a montage. So how exactly do we do this? How do we get through moments like this without causing these moments of friction and confusion? Well, one thing we can do is just start stripping away the awkward gaps. So this moment of narration might sound something more like this. You can see the network of rivers ahead of you. As you cross the half-mile distance between you and the rivers, the sound of the rapids is getting louder and louder. By the time you're standing in front of the river, you have to raise your voice just to be heard over the rushing water. The second approach is to start using the language of a montage in your descriptions. If you're anything like me, you already tend to use some minor cinematic flourishes to enhance your scenes. In this scenario, you would just lean into that and use editing terms to help control the flow of time. You see the rivers far ahead of you, about half a mile away, and you can see that they stretch for miles to either side. We cut from what was essentially an establishing shot to the banks of the first river, as you are now standing in front of the waters of the Gilded Run, the rapids rushing by. Now, Matt doesn't really do this. It is extremely uncommon for him to ever use such explicitly cinematic language, describing imaginary camera moves or edits, which is totally fine. It's his game. It's okay if that's not part of his style. His style seems to be more influenced by audiobooks than it is about movies and TV. But there are occasional moments where he runs into friction, like the one we're discussing today, and I just think that openly using that sort of description would help. A third option is to just go even further. Just tell your players, we are now entering a travel montage. Now, full disclosure, I think this approach works better for longer sequences. Remember, we're discussing a single moment from a game where characters just have to cover a half mile. You don't usually need a montage for that. But if you want to start doing establishing shots, then yeah, I would say lean into the montage, lean into the idea of editing. If you and your players already know that travel montages are a thing in your games, especially for longer travel sequences, then a small moment like this won't cause any friction, whether the destination is half a mile away or 4 days away. And you can basically make this collaborative. Allow your players to jump in with descriptions of what their characters are doing, if they want to. This would actually solve the issue we had in this scene. Matt could say, we're going to enter a montage. As you emerge from the trees, you can see about a mile ahead of you, beyond the shifting grass, a network of rivers at the base of a mountain. And he could give his fancy description, as he always does, and then he could turn to them and say, does anyone want to add anything before we reach the destination? And his players could either tell him, yes, maybe Vax is sneaking ahead 50 feet, Vex is riding on a broom and scouting the skies around them, Scanlan is playing music and teaching their satyr companion a song, just a quick moment from anyone who wants literally just 10 or 20 seconds of role-playing. And once they've said their piece, you end the montage with the party at their destination. And I honestly think players enjoy being involved in montages. I haven't run that many in D&D, but I've played in a lot of story games, especially games like Fiasco or Feng Shui, where you and your group are invited and encouraged to imagine your game like it's a movie. And when you invite your players to not just play in a game that has some tropes from movies or follow the structures of a movie, but you actually invite them to help your game include more cinematic elements like descriptions of camera moves or editing, I think you'll be surprised by just how into it they get. After all, The Lord of the Rings is this massive shadow over all of modern fantasy, including D&D, and asking your players to help describe a montage empowers them to do the thing from the movie. Some of its most iconic moments are characters just traveling from point A to point B. And if you incorporate the montage into your games, then you can capture some of that magic around the table. And that won't just help limit the number of awkward moments like the one Matt had with his players, but it'll also create a nice moment in your game. Remember earlier I talked about the collaborative nature of storytelling that we saw a glimpse of in the Lord of the Rings movies? Well, D&D is the most collaborative storytelling that anything gets. And so we can actually really have these fantastic moments where everyone is on the same page because we're all sharing in tropes together. And I think players really enjoy that.
And so it was that the group began to describe themselves walking. And as they described themselves walking, so did Obed confirm they walked.
I walk with them.
Thank you so much for watching. I actually was not planning to upload a video today, but then I accidentally wrote like 4,000 words about a 2-minute exchange, and it was absolutely going to destroy the pacing of that Critical Role Demystified video, so here it is as its own thing. However, while you're here, I want to thank some viewers who sent some 3D printed dice towers and dice vaults to me. They actually sent these to me several months ago, but I've been busy with the baby, and I completely forgot to show them off on camera. So I want to show them to you. This is an Owlbear dice vault. It's super cool and adorable, and hopefully the camera is picking up all the nice detail on it. And it is just extraordinary. He's probably, I would say he's going to go up there, but all of this stuff is probably going to be off these shelves and in a different room or in a box in the garage by the end of the month at the very latest, so he's not going to stay up there, but he's going to find a home pretty soon, I can guarantee that. And they sent me some fun dice towers, but my absolute favorite is this one, because this one is incredible. It just, I'm gobsmacked when I look at this thing. I can't even imagine, first of all, anything related to 3D printing just feels like magic to me, but this especially is just beyond the pale. And they're online too. This is not sponsored by them or anything, but you can check them out on Instagram and TikTok. Check out the handle Printopotamus, give them a follow, and check out what they're making. They're pretty incredible. If you want to support this channel, give this video a like, hit the subscribe button, and ring the bell. Patreon helps me keep the lights on. I've got a Discord server full of cool people, and I have a newsletter where you can catch my occasional updates. And make sure your voter registration is up to date. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. Click here to see the video where I throw out a bunch of my old D&D notebooks. It's a lot better than it sounds. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.